Claudio Lomnitz is an anthropologist, historian, and critic, writing and reflecting, broadly speaking, on Latin American culture and politics. Professor of anthropology at Columbia University, his books include Death and the Idea of Mexico from 2005 and 2014's The Return of Comrade Ricardo Flores Magón, among many others. He was from 2006 to 2011 the editor of the academic journal Public Culture. He's also written 2 plays in collaboration with his brother Alberto Lomnitz, a theater director in Mexico City. With his biweekly column in the newspaper La Jornada and a monthly column in Nexos, as well as his playwriting, Professor Lomnitz is committed to bringing historical and anthropological understanding of Latin culture into public debate. His book, Nuestra America, My Family in the Vertigo of Translation, is the subject of tonight's talk. Please join me in welcoming Claudio Lomnitz.
Thank you very much, Ware. Thank you, everyone, for your interest in sharing this discussion of my most recent book, just hot off the press. Here's what it looks like. It came out 2 or 3 years ago, and its title is Nuestra America, which means Our America, My Family in the Vertigo of Translation. It's a family memoir. And it's a sustained reflection on the conditions of existence of my grandparents, mostly my maternal grandparents, but also some on my paternal grandparents, led me through a slew of places that I'd forgotten, or I discovered that I'd forgotten before knowing them. It's a kind of experience, rather than a kind of déjà vu experience. Writing this book was more like exploring something like the presque vécu, the almost lived, rather than the already seen or already remembered. And there's something about recovering things that one didn't know and that at the same time impacted one's life that you experience when you work on a family memoir. And this particular book ends during my early childhood. So it's a biography of sorts, but it ends very early. In fact, the question of my childhood had been important in my mind as I worked on this, in part because I kind of had always been a bit curious about how it was, how to explain the happy childhood that I had in Chile, where I was born, and then later in California, and finally in Mexico City, where I grew up. How it was possible that I'd had in some ways such a enchanted childhood, despite coming from a really quite terrible history. Well, not only a terrible history, but also a terrible history. So what I thought I'd do tonight, since it's impossible to weave through all of the places and historical contexts that are explored in the book, is to dwell on a couple of the themes that are in it. Just there's only time for 2 or 3, and do that while reading little snippets of the work here and there to give you the flavor. So the first of the themes that's in the book is to do with the connection between the foreigner and normality, or the migrant and normality, and the role of the migrant and the immigrant as witness. This book is the family history deals with my maternal family was from Bessarabia, and in Eastern Europe, and they emigrated, my grandparents, to Lima in Peru in the 1920s. And then they were expelled from Lima in 1930 because of their political activities. And then they emigrated to Colombia, went back to Europe, to France to study for a while, then back to Bessarabia to try to get the family out before the Holocaust, then back to Colombia. In 1949, they emigrated to Israel. In 1955, they returned to Colombia. So it's a South American and European story that really deals with the connection between the destruction of Europe that we see in the first half of the 20th century and South American culture in particular. So the first little couple of pages that I'm going to read are from a portion of the introduction. It's a section called Family History for What? This is an account that speaks of how strangers help shape everything that we call ours. It begins in exile, like the Odyssey, and it bends and strains towards reunion. It is my family's story, and it's also my story. The collapse of Europe triggered a dizzying cycle of displacement. So much so that this account appears to have an unpredictable quality, skipping between countries and provinces that were only remotely connected. In many of those places, Peru, Colombia, Romania, France, Israel, Chile, Mexico, my family has had the kind of role that in Hollywood is known as a cameo, fleeting apparitions, minor parts, testimonials. There's something very Jewish about this. In the Christian kingdoms of medieval Iberia, for example, the Jews were the property of the king, who referred to them as our Jews. They lived in Jewish quarters, juderias, and moved about the cities dressed in peculiar clothing that was both a mark and a seal. Nevertheless, marginal though they were, those Jews of the king had an important role in the spiritual life of the community. They were condemned to be eternal witnesses of Christian happiness, to which they had turned their backs when they denied that Jesus was the Messiah. According to the logic of the Christian monarchs, Jews must be confined, identified, and punished, true, but they must also be protected so that they could carry out the theological role of the condemned witness, always present but never invited to the banquet. Someone is always required to envy whatever is deemed to be normal, because normality can scarcely justify itself on its own terms. Of course, there was also a material function for these people. Christian law prohibited usury. Jewish law also prohibited it, but only within the religious community. That is, Jews could freely charge Christians interest. For this reason, Christian monarchs made sure that, quote, their Jews were moneylenders and that they charged interest. This marked them as usurers and thus all but ensured that Christians would reject them as sinners. Afterward, the king would levy taxes against these same Jews, making himself the ultimate beneficiary of the greatest part of the income earned through usury, though without himself having ever violated Christian law. To use a rather unpleasant Jewish concept, the Jewish usurer was something like the Christian king's version of a Shabbos goy. The Jew did what was religiously forbidden to the Christian, but he did it for the Christian's benefit even more than for his own. The point is that Jewish marginality was in fact crucial for the Christian order. The Jew's place as forced witness served to highlight the blessings of that order, a dramatic role akin to that of hired mourners, whose loud wailing lent gravity to the funerals of great personages. On the other hand, the supposed fiscal immorality of the Jews was in fact indispensable for the proper functioning of the Christian economy, and their marginalization was nothing if not a formula to separate capitalism both from society and from the person of the king, without the crown losing any of its earnings. Jewish marginalization was a useful fiction, costly for Jews, of course, but convenient for those in power. Something similar happens to those who are relegated to immigrant status in national societies. They're a shadow, like the Jews in medieval Iberian towns, and they're also a witness that reminds the citizen of the nation's real or imagined, the citizens of the nation's real or imagined blessings. The myth of the American dream would not hold if there were not migrants who were perceived to desire a life in the United States. And then again, migrants perform indispensable work that people from, quote, good families prefer not to do, even while national societies prefer to imagine, national society prefers to imagine that it can get by without them. Like the medieval Jew, today's migrant is at once a demeaned witness and a key economic player, necessary, but always made to feel dispensable. So that issue of migration and the connection between Jewish history, the theological role of the Jew as witness, and the foreigner as witness, and the migrant as witness, and the consolidation of Latin American culture and South American culture in the 20th century is one of the themes that runs through this book. Now, a second theme is the discovery of Nuestra America, Ibero-America, also as a Jewish America. So the term Nuestra America is very well known in Latin American intellectual and cultural history, perhaps best known since José Martí, the famous Cuban journalist and revolutionary poet, in the 19th century, wrote an essay with that title dedicated to thinking about Ibero-America, mostly in contrast or contradistinction, really, to Anglo-America, that is, to the US, where Martí, of course, lived here in New York as an exile. Martí's essays also dwells a lot on Ibero-America as a land of mixture and of racial mixture, something that I think later would be called racial democracy, but a mixture as a source of Ibero-American culture. Now, when I began writing this book, my own sense and usage of the term Nuestra America, our America, was a little bit more intimate and less ambitious than Martí's. I was thinking about Nuestra America, that is, as my family's America in the first place, in particular because my family was a Jewish family in a highly minoritarian context. Like, for instance, my grandparents, as I mentioned, met in Lima in the 1920s, and at that time in the whole of Peru, there were about 2,000 Jews, half of whom lived in the provinces. And when they were kicked out of Peru, they moved to Colombia, where there were like 4,000 Jews, and they lived mostly in the provinces of Colombia, where they were often the only Jewish family or one of 2 or 3 Jewish families in the towns in which they lived. So because it was such a minoritarian experience, I had first thought of the idea of Nuestra America in my family memoir as I said, as a highly minoritarian experience. But as I continued to write, I began to become more and more convinced that the destruction of Europe in the 20th century, and the Jews are one of the key figures of that destruction in America, of course, in fact created something like a fourth root for Latin American culture, fourth root comparable to the 3 classic roots that are present in Martí and other thinkers, Vasconcelos and the like, that is, the European, the indigenous, and the African root of Latin American culture. I believe that the destruction of Europe and its emigres, and most particularly its Jewish emigres, but not exclusively its Jewish emigres, created something like a fourth root that was committed to a universalist and cosmopolitan project, but at the same time that was really latched on to America, to South or North America, not only for their own survival, but to a large degree for the survival of a free world, or a free alternative to the Europe that they had led or fled. So that's a second theme in this book, and I'm going to read a short a piece from another section of the initial chapter that is called America, and that deals with this subject. My father knew a lot about geology, and according to his point of view, South America is an immature continent. The Andes were to him dizzyingly dramatic, mother of stone, foam of condors, as Pablo Neruda put it. As a geophysicist, he did not find peace amid such deep stirrings. When I was 4 years old, we took a family trip to Peru. Among my memories of the journey is a stop in Arica, as well as a nauseating plane ride to Pisco. I preserve in my mind an image of the red callous desert of Atacama and of the Morro de Arica, the site where the Peruvian colonel Alfonso Ugarte threw himself into the abyss rather than surrendered to the Chilean army, and the taking of the frigate El Huáscar in that same War of the Pacific of 1879 to 1883, when the Chilean military beat Peru and Bolivia and appropriated their southernmost provinces. In those days, we boys still played with lacquered lead soldiers, and as a proud Chilean, all of this fascinated me. I remember also an afternoon among the cliffs of the Antofagasta coast, walking with my brothers looking for anemones and starfish. The sun-filled and freezing Pacific snorted up between the slender tongues of perforated rock. An octopus hid itself in the whirlpool. Later, in Lima's Chorrillos neighborhood, I read a plaque commemorating the struggle of the valiant Peruvian people, quote, against Chilean barbarism. I was 4 then and read rather slowly, so that when I finally came to the part on the Chilean invaders, I cried out in disbelief. Mommy, it says here, Chilean barbarians. We, good-hearted Chileans, were barbarians. In Lima, we also visited an archaeological dig. My grandfather Misha was there, though I don't recall how he got there or why. He knew the archaeologists, or at least he knew how to approach them, because they allowed us to touch the cloth that covered some mummies that they were removing. I remember them giving him a strip of that ancient cloth, although I might be mistaken about that. This was my first contact with the magic of antiquity. The dryness of the Peruvian coastal desert can preserve cloth for hundreds and even thousands of years, and it was possible to touch that cloth, to interrogate it. My grandparents did not accompany us to Cusco nor on the rest of that trip because of Misha's heart condition. There was once a photograph of my grandfather at that spot, but now I can't find it. I substituted with another of the self-same Misha, but young and in a different locale in Peru. He has in his lap a skull, as if he were Hamlet, posing with a pre-Incan Yorick. To be or not to be indigenous, or better put, as the great Brazilian modernist Oswald Andrade would write at around that same time, to be or not to be? Was this perhaps the question my grandfather was asking? I doubt it. More likely, as the committed Jew and Marxist that he was at that time, he was inclined to see the present reflected in the mirror of Incan glory. Today's Indians, though subjugated, would once again become great. Though imperiled, the Jews were also again becoming great. This was the source of his energy and enthusiasm for Hebrew, as well as for his passion for the emancipatory spark that he intuited in indigenous communalism. My grandfather was not then a wavering prince like Hamlet. Rather, he was a man compelled to create a future out of a present that was always precarious and from a past that was crumbling around him. For him, the idea of a new world was a necessity. His idea of America had less to do with nostalgia for the past than with a reality that needed to be achieved. Our America, the America of my family, was a necessary place that one must inhabit and defend. Even today, we still live in a dangerous world that is constantly asking us to make decisions. Yet we can only face our collective dilemmas by way of encrypted personal stories. Because, as Walter Benjamin put it, to tell the past is to take ownership of a memory just as it glimmers in the instant of a danger. Thus, peril is at once collective and deeply personal. We're no longer governed by tradition, so we can't simply rely on a collective past. For this reason, family history is again relevant. It is no longer an aristocratic incantation of the glories of a lineage, but very simply our precondition, a matrix of past decisions that make us possible. And we stretch back to those decisions in moments of danger, as if we were migratory birds flying in formation toward the south. The third theme that I wanted to raise here with you is to do precisely with this issue of the moment of danger from which this book was written, and a concern of the work of ordinary people and of intellectually oriented people, intellectuals, with the question of either the promotion of fascism or authoritarianism, totalitarianism, as well as in the struggle against it and other. So that's also one of the themes that's in this book, since these grandparents of mine were involved in that struggle, even from quite apparently insignificant places, like such as, for example, towns in provincial Colombia in the 1930s and 40s. So the snippet that I'm going to read in connection to this is regards the role of Romanian intellectuals in the rise of fascism in that country. Bessarabia, the region that my grandfather was from, when he was born, the town that he was from, Nowa Sulica, was on the border between the Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that is between Bessarabia and Bukovina. But after World War I, it was annexed to Romania, and my grandfather left in 1923. So at the time when Romanian fascism was beginning to emerge. And this section here is about the role of intellectuals in Romanian fascism. It's titled Iphigenia in Bucharest. Eliade wrote his first drama in the autumn of 1939, and it was performed in the National Theatre of Bucharest at the beginning of 1941, just before the Romanian invasion of the Soviet Union. It was a version of Euripides' Iphigenia in Aulis, so it dealt with sacrifice. In the Iphigenia of Euripides, Agamemnon has offended the goddess Artemis, who vents her spleen by preventing the Achaean fleet from leaving port. The wind doesn't blow, and the Greek ships can't sail. The Achaeans consult the seer Calchas, who suggests that Agamemnon must sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia in order to placate Artemis. In the end, Iphigenia volunteers to be sacrificed, as she prefers to be remembered as a national heroine than to marry and live a long life at the expense of the Achaean people. Eliade would make use of this legend to write a play dedicated to the sacrifice of Ion Mozza and Vasile Marin, two Iron Guard militants who decided to go to Spain to fight on the side of fascism during that country's 3-year civil war. They both died on the same day in 1937, fighting to capture Madrid. Mozza's and Marin's bodies were repatriated and paraded by train from town to town on their way to a mass funeral in Bucharest. Crowds gathered at each stop, with the people crying in unison that they would gladly sacrifice themselves for the fatherland to avenge their fallen countrymen. In the same year as Mozza and Marin's funeral, Eliade found himself stripped of his professorship at the University of Bucharest because of his activities in the Iron Guard, which was a clandestine organization then. A year later, he was arrested as part of a government crackdown on the far right that charged him with authoring Iron Guard propaganda. During this tense period, Eliade wrote newspaper articles glorifying Mozza and Marin and praising the Iron Guard's founders. When he was released from jail in November 1938, he immediately set to work on Iphigenia. Eliade's work confirms Ionesco's complaint. For a fascist, this is, of course, Mircea Eliade, and Ionesco's Eugene Ionesco, the playwright. Eliade's work confirms Ionesco's complaint. For a fascist, the state is concrete, while human beings are immaterial. To Eliade, a mythical character from antiquity like Iphigenia was transcendent, and the martyrs Moza and Marin were transcendent. But the flesh and blood humans who were to be sent to die in war in order to follow such immortal sacrifices mattered little. What really mattered was the immortality of their gesture, and not the fact that invading the Soviet Union implied sending the Romanian army off to slaughter. Eliade was also fond of another story that he believed offered a key to understanding the true Romanian essence, the legend of Master Manole. It tells of the construction of a great cathedral, a process that ultimately requires the pious master builder Manole, through a dream vision, to bury his pregnant wife alive in the building's foundation. The story is, in essence, a Christian version of the tale of Iphigenia, the willing sacrifice of what one holds dearest for a higher ideal. Through all their fixation on sacrificial ecstasy, Romanian fascists never stopped to consider that the Jews perhaps might also form a part of their community if given a chance. To them, the mass murder of Jews was an act of common prophylaxis. The death of two imbecilic heroes who went to Spain voluntarily to fight for Franco moved the country to tears, but the cowardly murder of 100, or even hundreds of thousands of Jews meant nothing except the purification of the nation. On the other hand, as the alleged source for all evils undermining the national community, Jews stabilized the fascist worldview, so anti-Semites might have felt some ambivalence about losing the Jews altogether. Their total absence might leave the surviving community with a melancholy feeling of having annihilated a people while still nursing the social ills for which they had been blamed. Maybe some of these fascists thought that they might bring the Jews back if they ever felt a need for them. If they did secretly hold such hopes, they were disappointed. Today in Romania, there's only their stark absence. Years after the war, Eliade published a strategically redacted edition of his diaries where he offered effusive praise for the writer Michael Sebastian, exclaiming, "How I empathize with his immense efforts and with all the suffering that came with each page he wrote. I will never forgive myself for not going back to see him in August 1942 when I returned to Bucharest for a week. I was ashamed of myself at that point. I was a cultural attaché in Lisbon, while he had suffered numerous humiliations for having been born and for wishing to remain Joseph Hector. I now agonize over this in vain, as it is too late." Joseph Hector had taken on the pen name Michael Sebastian and insisted in his writing that there was such a thing as a Romanian Jew, that it was possible to be both Jewish and Romanian. With the publication of these lines about Sebastian having been humiliated for wishing publicly to remain Jewish, Eliade revealed himself to be a rascal and a con artist. The affection and admiration that he had for Sebastian were genuine. The two were very close friends. But Eliade was personally responsible for at least a few of the humiliations suffered by Sebastian for, quote, wishing to remain Joseph Hector. And as an ideologue of the rabidly anti-Semitic Iron Guard, Eliade could hardly expect Sebastian to have had an easy time, quote, remaining Joseph Hector. Eliade mentions his shame for not having visited Sebastian in 1942, supposedly provoked by the privileges that he knew he enjoyed as a cultural attaché in fascist Portugal, while Sebastian was humiliated for, quote, wishing to be Jewish in Bucharest. But Sebastian was not being persecuted for wishing to remain a Jew. He had been raised Jewish whether he liked it or not, and everyone knew that he was Jewish. Meanwhile, in all his pathetic self-recrimination, Eliade somehow fails to mention that anti-Semitism was part of the very foundation of the Iron Guard, to which he had himself been so committed. In his discussion of the origin of the image of the rhinoceros, Eugen Ionesco clearly identified the pivotal role that anti-Semitism had for Romania's fascists. I quote, "I've witnessed transformations of people into rhinoceroses. I've seen people change almost before my very eyes. There's the example of capital letter I. He was part of our group. We were young then, so how could we intellectually resist all of the specialists who had converted into fanatics? Sociologists, cultural philosophers, biologists who had found, quote, scientific reasons to justify racism, writers, journalists. One day I showed up and told us that we were right, of course, and that the rest were without a doubt monstrous or stupid. Nevertheless, he said, it's strange that at times, they seem to be right on a particular point, one point out of 10,000, such as, for example, they say that the Jew, at that moment, we all realize that capital I has already been trapped by the machine. I gave them between 4 and 6 weeks before they succumbed definitively, giving in to the temptation of power. Anti-Semitism was, in fact, the original feature of the rhinoceros. Sebastian, for his part, was an unusual witness to the Jewish genocide in Romania because he knew it from his gestational period in the 1930s, since he worked and lived alongside the crème de la crème of Bucharest intellectuals. So many of them were leaders of the Iron Guard. Sebastian also witnessed how his old friend Mircea Eliade wrote articles from his post as attaché in Portugal as a kind of Nero, playing the lyre with his fascist panegyrics, while the Red Army destroyed the Romanian army at the Battle of Stalingrad. After the war, Eliade covered up his role in the elimination of the Jewish population of Romania, but he and his companions in fact accomplished their mission, as Jews are now largely absent in that country. The final theme that I wanted to share with you is the writing of a family memoir, of this memoir, as a source of transformation of my judgment of my own family. And I'll read a couple of pages from the final sections of the book. This part is about my father, and I'll end there and open it up for discussion. The section's title is Mesohippus. My family moved to Berkeley when I was 7 years old. It was 1964. As a boy, I caught a glimpse of the free speech movement and later on the flowering of the hippie movement, the arrival of Bob Dylan and rock music, the golden age of Telegraph Avenue with its throngs of beautiful dropouts in long skirts or flared jeans, their long hair flowing freely, the black light on phosphorescent posters announcing Jimi Hendrix concerts at the Fillmore, the arrival of the Hare Krishnas and incense, Leopold's records, Moe's books. I always loved Berkeley. In December 1964, while my brothers and I were busy discovering the infinite pleasures of colored television, non-existent in Chile at the time, on a gorgeous Sylvania TV set, student activist Mario Savio gave his famous speech against the mechanization and serialization of the university. Quote, "There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part." It was the start of a generational rift in a struggle against what was then known as the establishment. My parents bought an old house in the Kensington section of the Berkeley Hills, 250 Cambridge Street, telephone number 524-6447, where we played incessantly. Young professors could still afford those kinds of places back then. We also spent a lot of time on the university campus, where we would often go pick up my father at his office, and above all, because my mother, who had begun her undergraduate studies, brought us at times to the parks for us to play while she read. 3 years ago, I gave a lecture at Berkeley, and I strolled through the parks that we had played in, the stream with its cantilever bridge, the dwarfed white oak with its hollow trunk, the shade of the giant redwoods. Those were years of discovery for me. My brothers and I attended the Kensington Hilltop School. The hill that led to the school was steep, so we would walk our bikes a good portion of the way up there, and we would coast downhill most of the way home, smelling the wet ivy on people's front lawns. At home, my parents watched the news with Walter Cronkite, which showed the war in Vietnam. In 1968, my brother Jorge, who was turning 14, began to let his hair grow and brought home our first Jefferson Airplane album. My father worked in the Department of Geophysics, which shared a building with paleontology. Its entrance displayed fossils from the Cenozoic and Mesozoic eras, including a few dinosaur bones. All of that fascinated me. As kids, my brother Jorge had introduced me to obsessive study, a passion for insects, for instance, a fascination with fire, gunpowder, and rockets, for putting together plastic models of planes, cars, and warships with epoxy glue, and a fascination with the heroes of the Iliad, The Return of Odysseus, Tintin, Babar, and the Hardy Boys. We built a platform high up on the pine tree behind our house, and Jorge designed a system of cords and pulleys to transmit handwritten messages that, like so many of our inventions, was pretty much useless. But there it was, just in case. We also put together useless collections of stamps. All of that. One day, my father asked a colleague to recommend a good place to go fossil hunting. He suggested a site that wasn't so very close, the Diablo foothills beyond Walnut Creek, where they had cut into a hill to make way for a railway line. It was a perfect place to find them because you could walk along the tracks, inspecting the exposed wall of the hill and start digging wherever you liked. My father chose a narrow cave, and we began to chip away. We would have been happy to have found the fossil remains of a clam, but surprisingly, we made a much larger find, the remains of a prehistoric horse, a Mesohippus. It took us hours to remove its skull from the hillside, still full of teeth. We also removed a few vertebrae and returned home late in the day with our treasure stuffed in plastic bags. We spent months cleaning that fossil with toothbrushes. Thanks to Sina, my father, the paleontological zeal that beat in our childish hearts brought us a true discovery connected to the evolution of the horse. My generous father died on July 7, 2016. My scientific education was mostly in Jorge's hands, who was also responsible for bringing the counterculture to our home. But the enchanted world in which we grew had my father as both condition and reference. Today, I think that his laissez-faire attitude toward our disorganized investigations was influenced by the libertarian spirit of the Mario Savios of Berkeley, and perhaps also by that unforgettable stanza of Dylan's, which reads almost as if it were a blessing for my father. May God bless and keep you always. May your wishes all come true. May you always do for others and let others do for you. May you build the ladder to the stars and climb on every rung. May you stay forever young. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lomnitz. I want to invite everyone who's watching to submit questions if you have any. We're going to move into a time of Q&A. So I do have a couple here coming in. The first one is, did both paternal and maternal grandparents come from Bessarabia? And does the book cover the story of both sets of grandparents?
No, my father was born in Germany, and the bulk of the book is about my maternal grandparents, but the whole last part and the beginning deal a lot with my father and my father's family, and it's actually quite a tremendous story, my father's story, and it was one of the things that I discovered in the book, because there was a big chunk of my father's life that had been kept from him, the story of his grandfather's assassination in the 20s by Freikorps, this sort of early Nazi movement, and which I was able to discover after his death. He never found out about it, and in the process, actually recalibrate a lot my own relation to my father.
Could you talk a little bit about the title of the book, Vertigo of Translation, as opposed to migration or immigration?
Mm-hmm. The book starts with a meditation on language. I didn't share with you the sections that are about that tonight. And starts with a meditation on language because I'm an anthropologist by training, but I'm also a historian. I taught in a history department for a long time. And so I have both of those disciplines. And when I started writing this book, I realized that it was a book that I very much wanted to write, but it was a book that I couldn't write as an academic because responsibly, certainly not as a historian, because I realized I didn't have 4 of the languages that I would have needed to do this. I speak 4 languages, but my grandparents spoke 8 and 9 languages each, and so because I had to deal with the problem of language from the start, that led to a deeper reflection on language loss for me, and on my own language, because although I speak several languages, as I mentioned, in fact, in the end, I'm actually bilingual. I'm always moved between Spanish and English. Spanish was my first language, the language of the home, but I learned English as a boy in Berkeley, and I've continued to speak English and write in English as well as in Spanish. So one of the things that I came up that I finally had to face in writing this book was not only the problem of the language loss, what the languages that my grandparents spoke, or even that my parents spoke and that I didn't, but also my linguistic insecurity, or what I feel is my linguistic insecurity. I feel that that I have some hesitations and stumblings, both in English and in Spanish. And that was for a long time a source of a certain amount of embarrassment for me, because I was meant, for example, to write Spanish better than I write English, because it was my mother tongue, but I don't really write Spanish better than I write English. I write both of them with all kinds of stumblings and problems. And I never have had the sense of ease in language that I think some people do, and certainly some monolinguals do. So the book starts with the problem of language loss and also distance from language, unease with language. And then it moves to the problem of translation, both in the sense of translation between languages, but also in the sense of movement, where you have family members. It's kind of hard. It was hard for me to understand, for instance, how was that my maternal great grandfather, the father of my grandmother, who took them to Lima with his wife. He and his wife went to Lima first, and then went to Colombia. Why they said they come from a town, a small town, a medium town in the Ukraine, Mohilev, and they settle in a town called Tuluá in the Valley of Cauca in Colombia. Well, how does that happen, and what does that mean? And a lot of what it means is actually to do with translation. Like, for example, this great grandfather, his name was Boris, had a soap factory in Mohilev in the Ukraine, a soap factory that, rather artisanal, maybe five, 6 workers. And in Tuluá, he sets up a factory like it. In fact, Tuluá has a position vis-a-vis Cali that is a little bit similar to Mohilev had, let's say, with regard to Odessa. These are towns that are far enough away from the big city to have a market for soap, but close enough so you find the problem of translation not only as a linguistic problem, which is constantly there, but also as an existential strategy that you either abandon or engage. And that's very much at the center of the book.
That's so fascinating. I am a person who only speaks one language and comes from the same place that generations back people lived. So it's so fascinating to hear a completely different story. Let's see here. Given the times we live in now, what do you think intellectuals of all types worldwide can and should do to undermine fascism and all kinds of racism, which include anti-Semitism?
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, one of the key things that we need to figure out collectively. I mean, first of all, we need to be conscious of how this stuff creeps in. I mean, I was really fascinated writing the book to read this this description of Ionesco about the rhinoceros. I was familiar with his play of the rhinoceros, which I don't know whether you've seen it or you've read it, but it's a story where everything is kind of quite common and everyday, but at the same time, these rhinoceroses start popping up all over the place, and people start kind of morphing into rhinoceroses all over the place. So it's an absurdist play, as a kind of surrealistic, but it gets to the heart of something, which is that this kinds of fascisms and these intense nationalisms, like Eliade was intensely nationalist in this period, start becoming kind of natural. And you start looking around, and all of a sudden people seem to be converging on this, and one feels a little bit estranged from one's own circumstances, from what surrounds us. And I think that to my mind, intense efforts at communication are necessary. And I don't know how exactly to do this. I mean, we're in the middle of that here in the U.S. I mean, and the communication across those breaches of belief is complicated, and it's a place where I would hope that people who are, who are reflective, who are intellectuals in the broadest sense, like in the Antonio Gramsci sense, that it's a faculty that we have rather than a specialty, who are reflective, can invent ways and find ways to build some kind of communication across some of those gaps, because it's a very, very distressing situation, and it's not at all peculiar to the US. We see it happening in Latin America, all over the place, and in Europe, of course, so elsewhere. I think it's something that we have to be thinking about and talking about amongst ourselves.
Ever diligent of.
Mm-hmm.
Does your book discuss the immigrant experience of other South American Jews?
It does, but only incidentally. For example, in the case of my grandfather's town, this town, Nova Sulica, most of the people who came from Nova Sulica and who settled actually quite widely across South America. There's a big community in Lima, but there were people who went to provincial cities, but also to Buenos Aires, to Caracas, to Bogota. Well, most of those people, when they arrived, worked as peddlers, clappers, they called them. And they were door-to-door salespeople. And I do deal with this problem of the clappers because I think that, and my grandfather himself wasn't a clapper, but he did work with them. He was he's like a middleman a little bit between a wholesaler who was a Sephardic Jew who'd arrived from the former Ottoman Empire, and who spoke Ladino. The Jews who arrived from the Ottoman Empire spoke Ladino, which is a form of Spanish, and is entirely comprehensible from Spanish and very easy to learn Spanish if you speak Ladino. And so my grandfather was talented at languages. So this guy, Mr. Sarfati was his name, hired my grandfather as a mediator with the clappers that it was, in other words, with the Romanian Jews that came with him who all spoke Yiddish, and so he couldn't understand them. He needed a translator. I do get into, for instance, the situation of these clappers because it's relevant to thinking about the social movements that my grandparents were involved in the 1920s in Peru, which was a movement in the left that was very involved on the one hand with cultural journalism, but on the other with party formation. They were in the close circle of a man named Jose Carlos Mariátegui that I write about quite a lot in the book. We were very close friends of Mariátegui. He was a very famous figure in South America and was the founder of a socialist party that later became the Communist Party of Peru. And the situation of the clappers with regard to that moment of creation of kind of mass working class parties is actually very, very interesting and quite innovative, and people haven't really written about it. So I do deal with that, for instance, or in the case of the German Jews in Chile, which is where my father and his family immigrated to Santiago, to Chile, which is where I was born. Was a really very different kind of, first of all, different moment and a different sociology. My grandparents on my father's side were of a more bourgeois origin. My grandfather was a lawyer, had been a lawyer in Germany, and their problems of moving and translocation were of a different kind. I mean, it did involve sort of loss of profession to a large degree. I mean, he couldn't practice as a lawyer in Chile, but at the same time there was, let's say, a class insertion that was a little bit different, both because of the timing and because of the origin. That is, the German Jews versus Eastern European Jews, and let's say 1938 when they arrive in Chile versus 1923-24 in Lima. So I guess that's a long answer. The short answer to your question is yes, a little bit, but in a kind of through the prism of what is relevant to my family history.
Well, we're getting a little short on time. I'm just going to ask this one final question here. Can you relate your experience to the decades of U.S. demonization of migrants from Latin and Central America?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that that introductory segment that I read suggested already something that is there, and I think that one of the interesting things is to do with a combination between kind of invisibilization and witnessing that is constantly there. That I think that Mexican immigrants in the US and Central American immigrants have often had a kind of shadowy presence. Very often it's unobtrusive. Like I remember I went to grad school in California. I got my PhD at Stanford in the late 70s, early 80s. And the cleaning staff was all pretty much Mexican at that time. There weren't that many Central Americans as many as there are now. A lot of this cleaning staff worked at night, so you didn't usually see most of the people who were there, and the place was kind of clean in the morning, um, so you have this kind of combination between reliance, deep reliance, and invisibilization, invisibility. That's one thing. The other thing I think is also interesting is the question kind of passing, of assimilation, maybe in some cases, but some cases not necessarily assimilation, but something that seems a little less like you're raw or fresh off of the boat, or freshly arrived, and completely like illiterate in the ways of the country that you arrive at. And I think that this kind of the kind of culture of passing is extremely important in the Jewish history, and I think it's extremely important in the Mexican and Central American histories in the U.S. as well, and something that we need to, I think about. Finally, this role to do with, I mean, there's some big differences too. For instance, my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, when he arrives in Lima, I mean, he had come from one of the areas of the world where the Jews were most strongly discriminated, both the Russian Empire before the revolution, and then Romania in the 1920s. These were some of the truly worst regions in terms of Jewish Jewish emancipation, the latest dates of Jewish emancipation, so citizenship rights and all that. So he arrives to Lima, and at Lima, in the end, he's a European there. So he moves from being like of a class that is deeply discriminated to a class that's in a privileged position, albeit in a somewhat insecure position. Nonetheless, in a higher, moves from lower to higher, let's say, in that thing. And that's very different from the Mexican and Central American migrations to the US. In fact, for example, Mexican migrations to the US, it's not uncommon actually for the opposite move to happen. That is, for instance, in the Mexican Revolution, you had really important people moving from the Mexico into the US, and in Mexico they were really important people. In the US they were, quote, Mexicans, which was first of all a racial category, and second, lumped everybody together, so they were the same as a peasant. Someone like Felipe Angeles, for instance, who was a general of the Mexican Revolution, highly trained in Europe, etc., came to New York during the revolution, worked as a busboy in a restaurant, and that was not uncommon. So the relationship of the migration to the US, I think, is one where the nature of class mobility is a little bit different from the nature of class mobility with the Jews in South America, but actually with very interesting points of contact and comparison.
Yeah, that's also fascinating to think about. Well, I want to thank you so much for sharing tonight, opening up your story to us, and it just sounds like it's such a rich history. I want to remind people that if they are interested in purchasing a copy of the book, you can click on the link in the chat, and that's going to take you over to Third Place Books to get a copy. And I want to thank everybody for watching and for your questions. And thank you again so much, Dr. Lomnitz. As Ware was saying before we started, I hope that we're able to see you in Seattle sometime in person. I hope you get to visit sometime.
I hope so too. I really like to see it, but thank you, and thank everyone for for staying up late and listening to these pieces of this memoir, and to celebrating actually with me the appearance of this book.